Hi, Jeremy Crow here. Welcome to an episode of my live stream. In this episode, we're going to be talking about longevity, alchemy, the elixir of life, all those good things. So, essentially, the esoteric quest for extreme longevity, immortality, physical longevity, as well as the body of light, where it's sort of like what you would call Taoist immortality, where you have a non physical vehicle for consciousness that is immortal, essentially. So this is a live stream, so if you have any questions along the way, then feel free to leave a comment on the live chat, and I'll read it and try and respond to it as best I can. But in the absence of any kind of questions or anything, I'll just talk about various different subjects relating to alchemy, extreme longevity, and immortality. So first off, there are several types of immortality, and we can go over the various different forms of immortality that's discussed within the esoteric realm. So first off, there would be extreme longevity, extreme physical longevity, and now I'm talking about living well past 100 years old. There is this concept that it's possible potentially to extend the lifespan of the physical body beyond what we would normally consider to be a normal lifespan. So I think extreme longevity generally would be longer than 100 years. Anything longer than 100 years, you could probably say counts, because most people don't live to be 100. At least in the time that I'm recording this video. If you're watching this well into the future, then maybe things have changed. But at the time that I'm writing this, not writing this, giving this live stream, in a lot of developed nations, we have an average lifespan of maybe 80 years or so. So there are people that live to be 100, and that is, for every person that lives to be only 60, then you have somebody who lives to be 100, right? Because 80 years is an average. But I think that if anybody lived past 100, they would consider that doing well. We have tales of people living much longer than that, and indefinitely, in a state of relative youth. So you have stories of someone like Saint Germain, also known as Prince Rakowski. And this is one of the so-called ascended masters, which is often talked about in theosophy. Now, this is a character who is supposed to be a real person, and he had like a bag of gemstones that he would carry around with him. He had some strange dietary habits. So often when he was seen in public, he would only ever be seen eating raw oatmeal, like from a bag that he would carry around with himself. He would never eat anything else in front of anybody else. So it could have just been an eccentric individual who had the ability to deceive people. When he first came onto the scene, he appeared to be roughly around 40 years old or so. But he lived a public life of I'm not even sure how long, but the entire time, I think he lived a public life of about 40 years or so, and the entire time he looked about 40. So it is possible that he maybe exaggerated how old he was at first, and then did things to make himself look younger as he did get older, such as dyeing his hair and beard, maybe to hide any gray. So it is possible he could have been a fraud that just tried to make people believe that he had some sort of elixir of life. But there are people who do believe that he had some form of the elixir of life. And now this is a famed substance that is obtained through alchemical processes. And we can get into what those alchemical processes are, but this is the form of extreme longevity that we're talking about here. That is one form of what people refer to as immortality. Now, this would be essentially living a life in your physical body, and your physical body remains relatively young indefinitely, although you could be killed in an accident or murdered or something along those lines. Oh, we have a comment here. Christine says, hello from the Blue Mountains. It's good to see you back, Night Owl. Yeah, it's not quite as late as I often do when I do a late night live stream. Sometimes I do a couple hours later than this, but that's why I didn't call it Insomniac's live stream like I do sometimes. But I had a specific theme that I wanted to talk about this time, so that's another reason why. But yeah, thanks for popping in and leaving a comment here. So yeah, that's one form, and it's a very desirable form of immortality, is living young in your physical body for as long as you want, really. And then potentially still being vulnerable to some sort of accident or intentional ending of life. So that would be one form. And another form is, you could call it like a hungry ghost, some people refer to it. And that would be to have some form of persistent presence as a non-physical entity. And usually this would be like a ghost. So there is, among the esoteric community and the paranormal community, you have this concept of a haunting ghost, a ghost which haunts a specific physical location. Some person who once lived in the flesh as a human being, who later on died, but left some form of imprint on the location that they lived, usually. Some people say that they had unfinished business and so stuck around. Or maybe they died in a traumatic manner and weren't able to process their own death. And so they are doomed to kind of relive the events over and over in a mostly non-lucid manner. So they're not really aware that they're a ghost reliving their death over and over. They think that they are in that moment, and then they forget, and then they repeat it over and over. It seems like a kind of a hellish existence, almost like some of the portrayals of hell that you see in literature, such as Dante's version of hell in his Inferno, the first part of the Divine Comedy. And often you'll see some form of ironic punishment where they are doomed to live out some form of suffering that they caused upon others, or something like that. Or like if they were a glutton when they were alive, then they are constantly hungry and are unable to satisfy that hunger in the afterlife. So it kind of reminds me of that. So this is one form of immortality that I would say would be undesirable. A slight variant of that would be the vampire, which would be like an undead entity, where often in the tales of the classic tales of a vampire, there is a physical body, but it is buried. Somebody who has died and was buried in a grave, and their spirit or soul, depending on which terminology you prefer. To me, I would refer to this more as the soul of the individual, the person's unique individuality, their non-physical aspects or attributes, embodied in kind of a non-physical vehicle, which would be like their ghost, I suppose you could say. Their ghost is tied to their dead body still, anchored to it, and kind of lives there during the day, but then at night will venture out and seek to steal life essence from the living in order to sustain itself in that afterlife state. And now there are versions of this called the Revenant, which would be like a more mindless kind of instinctual type entity that just kind of just knows that they're hungry, and they go out and seek the life force of living beings and to feed on. And there are more conscious or lucid versions of this, which would be more vampire proper, and they will go out and intentionally try and feed from the life force of the living. Now, sometimes this will come in the form of puncturing the individual's physical body and drawing blood from them, but often it will be in the form of life force in general. And you see this very similar concept to the succubus or the incubus, which is an entity that isn't necessarily somebody who once was alive, but it is an entity that comes in the night to feed from the vital life forces, and in particular the sexual force of the living, and often of those who are sleeping, and will wake up and they will find that they have been mounted by an entity that is the succubus or the incubus. That's either the female or the male version, and that they would be drained of their kind of sexual life force by this entity while they were lying in bed. And often this will happen to an individual while they are experiencing a sleep paralysis. Okay, we have another comment by Miss B. Just says hi. Hi, Miss B. Thanks again for stopping in. I know you often catch my live streams, so that's pretty cool. Today we're talking about longevity. If anybody who hasn't been here since the beginning, we're talking about longevity, different forms of immortality, and the tie-in with alchemy. So I was just going over some different forms of immortality and kind of riffing off of those very tangents from that. So another form of immortality would be what in the Western esoteric tradition is often referred to as the body of light. Now, in some more Eastern forms of esotericism, sometimes it's referred to as the diamond body or the rainbow body. Now, what this would be is a non-physical body or non-physical vehicle for consciousness, for the soul, in a sense. Like I mentioned earlier, the soul would be the individual's unique non-physical attributes, in a sense. So your personality, often your memories, your seat of consciousness, your self-awareness, in a sense, Not necessarily all of those things are considered part of the soul by everybody and by every tradition, but I'm just kind of giving you a general idea of what is often attributed to what the soul is. So this would be like generating a non-physical body that is incorruptible, that doesn't decay, that your consciousness or your soul can inhabit after the physical body stops working. And like I said, it's often referred to as the body of light. It's sometimes referred to as an ascension body, or as the body of a Taoist immortal. Sometimes it's compared to the resurrection body of Christ. It's very similar to what you would experience as a dream body. So when you are having the dreaming experience, the vehicle of consciousness that you are experiencing the experience through, rather than being your physical body during a waking experience, during a dreaming experience, your vehicle is the dream body. So the body of light would be something similar to a dream body, but it is kind of like an upgraded version, in a sense, where it doesn't break down after the death of the physical body. So there's this concept that you may have heard of called the second death. And there's different terms for it in other traditions, but let's just use the second death as the term we're going to use. Now, this is a term that's used in Revelation, the final book of the Christian scriptures, where what is the line? It was something along the lines of, those who can acquire the morning star will avoid the second death, something like that, which is very interesting, because morning star to me is a reference to the light bringer archetype. It is a reference to Venus as the last bright object in the sky before the sun rises. It appears as a star in the sky, heralding the rising of the sun. And that is why it's the morning star. It's the last star that's like, oh, there's that one bright star in the sky. It's not actually a star. It's the planet Venus, but it looks like a star in the sky. And it's the last one before the sunrise. And this is the light bringer, or the light bearer. And in Latin, that translates to the word Lucifer, which of course folklore has now turned into a character synonymous with Satan. But it didn't used to mean that. That's a relatively recent development, which came about through folklore, really, developing a folklore through John Milton, and interpretations of certain passages in the Bible by individuals who looked at, John Milton's story, Paradise Lost, looked at some other, folkloric stories, and interpreted the Bible in that way to mean that. To me, it's a bit of a stretch. It didn't used to mean that. And Jesus himself was often referred to as a light bearer by Christians. And still, to this day, you'll find that in some of the Latin liturgies of the Roman Catholic Church, they'll use the word Lucifer. And there are all these videos coming out saying, oh, the Pope is worshiping Lucifer, No, he's not. He's using the word Lucifer, which is a Latin word that means light bearer. He's using it as a title for Jesus. In the Roman Catholic Church, the word Lucifer doesn't mean Satan, and it never did, and it still doesn't. There's even a Saint Lucifer in the what is it, the liturgical calendar, and I think it's March 20th or something. And yeah, that word in the Roman Catholic Church doesn't mean Satan. It doesn't even mean Satan before the fall, as a lot of people like to claim. It just means light bearer, and it's often used as a title for Jesus. So those videos, that's me debunking that video. A little bonus here is me debunking those videos saying that the Pope is worshiping Lucifer publicly. You know, no, he's using the word Lucifer in its original meaning of light bringer, or light bearer, and specifically as a title of Jesus. And in Revelation, Jesus himself refers to himself as the bright morning star, the resurrected Jesus, which is kind of interesting. So this resurrection body of Christ is essentially the same thing as the body of light. And now, how do you achieve that? Well, it's one form of the alchemical process. So let's go over what the alchemical process is. So you start off with the prima materia. Now, some people say that this isn't this. You know, there are different interpretations of all of these alchemical terms, but let's just, for the purposes of this video, let's just say prima materia is the matter that you're starting with. So that could be anything. The starting material. Some people say it's some form of primordial, but I think that that's more the chaos of elements that is the primordial material. But let's not get too bogged down in terminology here. So the alchemical process, you start with something. Oh, I appreciate all the likes, you guys. If you haven't hit the like button yet, you know, I really appreciate it. It helps out the channel a lot. But with alchemy, you start out with something. You break it down into a chaos of its constituent elements, and then you separate out each of those what is the word I'm looking for here, the principal elements. So you have the three principal elements of salt, sulfur, and mercury. Let's just use those for this example. So you separate out that chaos, you ferment it down. First you take that starting material, you break it down using the death force to ferment it. Sometimes it's referred to as putrefaction, as the stage of alchemy. Putrefaction, where you break it down. It's a controlled use of the death force where you break something down, but you don't lose any of the parts. It doesn't scatter. You keep it contained within a sometimes alembic or something like that, or a beaker, you know, in these old classic images. But it's in a contained space, and it's broken down into a chaos of its principal elements. Then you separate out each of those principal elements and individually purify it. So these impurities are often referred to as the caput mortuum, which is the death's head, or sometimes referred to as terra damnata, or damned earth. And essentially it's the impurities that are bound to that particular principal element. So each of those principal elements are separated out from the chaos and purified, and then once they're all of them are purified, you recombine them, and over time they form such strong bond between the components that they essentially become unified into a whole that is so well integrated that it is extremely difficult to break it apart again. So just to summarize, you start with something, you break it down into a chaos of its parts, you separate out each of the main components, purify each of those main components, and then take the purified elements and recombine them and let them integrate. That last stage is called cohobation. And then they unify. Now, if we look at what happens when we die, the physical body, the various different components that make up the physical body, the bonds between those components start to break down, and the elements end up going off to make other bodies, really, and that's the cycle of life. Now, if we take the Hermetic axiom of as above, so below, well, what happens to the non-physical part of ourselves when we die? Well, the same thing, essentially, is it gets subjected to a corrosive force, in a sense, on that other plane, on the non-physical plane. And the bonds between the components will start to weaken, and the component parts will break apart. And those components go off to make other non-physical bodies. Now, because it's on a different level, it doesn't have the same limitations as the physical does. So you can make copies of something non-physical infinitely without it doesn't have that limitation. So there can be different copies everywhere. But I'm getting a little too complicated here. So the non-physical body, let's say the soul, the different parts that it's composed of, and we know that we are very fragmented individuals. Every person alive essentially has a very fragmented soul. Any internal conflict you have is evidence of that. That one part of yourself wants one thing and another part of yourself wants another thing that could be directly opposed to that. And you can have opposing interests fighting within yourself. So that's a very common experience for most people to have. And that's just scratching the surface. There are different parts of the mind that don't communicate with other parts of the mind, right? H.P. Lovecraft famously said in his Call of Cthulhu, in the opening part, the most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. Something along those lines. I might have gotten one or two words off, but I think that's pretty close. We're extremely fragmented individuals on the non-physical level, and so the fragments that make up our soul break apart under that corrosive influence of the afterlife, you could say. And then those fragments go off and get reused, get recycled. Now, what if we were to achieve that high level of unity that is the result of the alchemical process on our own soul? Well, then, when we are exposed to that corrosive force, the death force, in the after, or in the non-physical plane, then it won't break down, because it will resist that, because there are no bonds between parts. It's just one holistic, complete, unified self. And will avoid the second death. That is the second death, is the breaking down of our non-physical aspect. The non-physical part of ourselves breaks down, like I said, as above, so below. Just like the body breaks down, the physical body, the non-physical body also breaks down. But, like I said, if you can achieve that alchemical process on the soul, on your own soul, before you die, then when you are subjected to that death force, that putrefaction, you'll come through it untouched. Now, some people say that this is a process of purging your karma, but if you've already done that before you die, then there's nothing to burn off in the crucible of the afterlife. So there's a lot of different ways of describing it, a lot of different analogies that can be used, but essentially, if you achieve that level of unity on the non-physical plane, then you can survive the second death, and that is the body of light. That unified, that complete, harmonized self. So that is the ultimate form of, well, not quite actually. The ultimate form of immortality for an occultist would actually be to take it even further beyond that. Once you've achieved that level of unity on the non-physical plane, the idea is to start integrating the more dense aspects of the self, the more physical parts of the self. Now, in some of the Eastern traditions, and in particular Tibetan Buddhism, you have this tradition that one sign of achievement, one sign of a very high level of achievement of an individual who is trying to achieve enlightenment and that, or Taoist immortality, or whatever you want to call it, when they die, there will be brightly colored or rainbow lights coming off of the physical body that are observed by individuals that are observing. And often you'll even hear that the physical body of the practitioner will shrink. Sometimes you even hear of extreme versions of this, where they say that sometimes over the course of a month or so after the individual has died, their entire body shrinks down to almost nothing except for maybe nails and hair and teeth, maybe even. That pretty much they carried up most of their physical body with them. And this is a form of what's the word? I mean, sometimes it's referred to as apotheosis, but it's a very specific form. Now, you'll hear about somebody like Enoch. So this is also the ascended master, the full version of an ascended master, the ultimate form of an ascended master, would be like Enoch, who was taken up into heaven in physical form, as one of the stories of the Old Testament, right? You also have in Catholic folklore the idea that Mary, Jesus' mother Mary, she got taken up into heaven in bodily form when she was 72, and it's referred to as the Assumption of Mary, that she was assumed into heaven physically, that she didn't have to taste death, and that happened at the age of 72. And somebody actually, Agar, asks, can you teach me how to use a pentagram? And it's funny because 72, the age 72 that Mary in Roman Catholic folklore was supposed to have been assumed into heaven, 72 actually happens to be one of the angles within a pentagram. 72 degrees. So I think that that's kind of an interesting connection there, and especially that it's synchronistic that Agar, that you would ask about the pentagram. Now I have, if you go to jeremycrow.com, there's a resource center, list of resources and articles that I have there, and one or two of them, there's one on how to use the pentagram, and I go into a bit of detail on how to use the pentagram in that article. I don't really have a lot of time left on this live stream to get into that, but if you go to jeremycrow.com and then check out the article list, there'll be there is one article that I have there where I have my own personal version of an Enochian lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram that you can read and practice if you'd like, or be inspired by to write your own ritual. But also I do have one dedicated article that talks about how to use the pentagram specifically, and I give a little bit of a beginner's practice on how to start getting used to the pentagram. And then once you've done that, then maybe you might want to tackle something a little bit more elaborate, like the Enochian pentagram ritual. Yeah, and so I wrote my own Enochian incantations, you might say, that are supposed to be equivalent to the English and Hebrew of the Golden Dawn's version of the Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Pentagram. So I did my own translation. I spent a lot of time on creating that kind of poetic wording, because I'm not sure if you're aware, but in the Enochian language, which is supposed to be the angelic language delivered by entities claiming to be angels to Dr. John Dee, court astrologer to one of the Queen Elizabeths. I can't remember which one, probably, I don't know, long time ago. And Sir Edward Kelly, who was kind of a bit of a scoundrel. Anyways, they did some workings, some esoteric workings that involved communications with spirit beings that claimed to be angels, and they taught them a language which is now referred to as Enochian, sometimes referred to as angelic, but usually Enochian. And that language has a very limited vocabulary. It doesn't have the same range of words that we have in English. So I had to get a bit creative when I was crafting that Enochian version of a pentagram ritual. So I'm actually pretty proud of my work on that. So I encourage all of you to check it out. While you're at my website, jeremycrow.com, I encourage you to sign up to my newsletter. Once you sign up and confirm your email address, you will get a download link for, I think it's a 26-page ebook that is the grade book for the first initiation of the Ziggurat of Enki, the esoteric order that is based on Sumerian and Babylonian mythology. And that particular ritual is based on the descent of Ishtar into the underworld. So that has a lodge group ritual initiation into that first initiation of the Ziggurat of Enki. So you'll get that once you confirm your email address. Now, I haven't really been doing a lot of newsletters, but I am determined to get one out this Friday, and I'm going to try and get back onto my schedule of the first and third Friday of every month putting out a newsletter, which basically gives an update on what what I've been up to in that 2-week period, the videos I put out, any other content that I put out, and what I'm working on, little updates on what's coming up in the future that you might want to be interested in. So you're not going to get flooded with emails if you sign up to this. You're going to get a couple emails a month, maybe a third one if there's a special occasion for me to put out an extra announcement for something or other. But at this point, there's only going to be 2 a month or so. Yeah, and I don't really have any time left to tackle any more questions or get any further in depth into this discussion of alchemy and longevity and immortality. But I think we covered a lot of really good points in this video. So yeah, that alchemical process on the soul, how to actually do that, could be a topic for another video coming up. I do have other videos that do tackle that subject on my channel, so you might want to check through the archives. And if you're interested, I've done a bunch of videos that kind of tackled alchemy, what happens when you die, what happens when an alchemist dies, a couple things like that. Also, there's some videos that I have in the Escape the Cube series that you might be interested in as well, if you're interested in the topic that we covered in today's video. So if you have any comments or anything, I'd love to hear it. Please leave a comment in the video below, especially after this is not a live stream anymore. If you're watching this, probably most people watching this are going to be watching this in the archive version. But either way, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this subject, and I respond to almost every comment that I receive if you give me enough time. I'm a very busy guy, but I do try and get to every comment that I'm able to. And thank you so much for everybody here that's popped in. We have Cruz. Eden says, thank you for a lovely live chat and have a good night. Agar says, thank you, blessings. Laura Ripley says, thank you. Miss B says, thank you. Agar says, we're all connected, bro, and thank you. You're very welcome, everybody. Oh, Christine says, I've heard of people not rotting. Yeah, that's an excellent point. I'm glad you brought that up. The incorruptibility of the saints is one version of that, where they say somebody who has achieved a high level of enlightenment or spiritual achievement during life, that their body after death does not decay. That's one of those signs of attainment that you hear about. Cruz says, thank you. Yeah, you're very welcome, and thank you, all of you. I wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't for you guys. That all of you that are part of this community, that show up to these live streams, that leave comments and like my videos and subscribe to my channel and all that. I really enjoy interacting with all of you, and you come up with some really great questions and comments that I think are excellent. And it's why I do this, is for the connection with all of you guys. And like I said, I really appreciate all of you. And until next time, everybody, stay lucid.